There's a generation that grew up online, got called lazy, got called sensitive, got called the most anxious generation in recorded history, and somehow a lot of that is true, but not for the reasons most people think. Let's actually go inside the psychology of Gen Z. Here's what's strange. If you asked someone in 1995 what a teenager's biggest fear was, they might say failing a test, embarrassing themselves at school, not fitting in, normal stuff. But when researchers started surveying Gen Z teenagers in the 2010s, something had shifted. The fears were bigger, more abstract. Climate collapse, economic instability, mass shootings, the feeling that the world itself was unreliable. And that's not a coincidence, it's a psychological imprint. Developmental psychologists call it ambient anxiety. It's the low-grade background noise of dread that builds up when someone grows up in an environment of constant uncertainty. Gen Z didn't just hear about global instability. They absorbed it through screens, through news alerts, through social media, during the exact years when their brains were still learning how to process threat and safety. The brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, was essentially being trained in real time by an internet that never turns off. But here's where it gets more complicated. Gen Z is also the most therapy-literate generation that has ever existed. They use words like boundaries, trauma response, and nervous system regulation in casual conversation. They built entire communities online around emotional honesty. That sounds like progress, and in many ways it is. But researchers have noticed something unexpected. Greater psychological vocabulary doesn't always mean greater psychological resilience. In some cases, it can actually lower it. There's a concept called symptom salience. When you're constantly exposed to the language of mental illness, when your feed is full of posts explaining every bad mood as a disorder, you can start to identify with symptoms even when the underlying distress is relatively mild. You're not faking it, your suffering is real, but the framework you're using to understand it might be amplifying it. This isn't a criticism of Gen Z, it's a consequence of growing up in the first information environment where mental health went viral. Now let's talk about identity, because this is where Gen Z genuinely breaks from every generation before them. Millennials grew up being told, figure out who you are, then stay that way. Identity was a destination. Gen Z grew up on platforms where identity is a performance, a filter, a daily construction. And that's not shallow, it's actually philosophically interesting. They were raised on the internet's implicit message that you can be multiple things at once, that categories are fluid, that you don't have to choose. Researchers at institutions studying adolescent development have found that Gen Z scores higher on what's called identity exploration, but lower on identity commitment than previous generations at the same age. They try on more selves, they're slower to commit to one. And in a world that changes as fast as theirs does, that might actually be adaptive, even if it looks like uncertainty from the outside. Here's a detail that surprised me. Despite being labeled the loneliest generation, Gen Z maintains more simultaneous social relationships than any generation before them. The average Gen Z person is in contact with significantly more peers on any given day than a millennial or Gen the 10th teenager was. But the depth of those connections is different. Psychologists distinguish between weak ties and strong ties. Gen Z is extraordinarily rich in weak ties, broad networks, lots of acquaintances, digital familiarity. Strong ties, the kind where someone really knows you, are harder to build on a platform designed for performance. And that gap between feeling connected and feeling known might be one of the defining psychological tensions of their generation. Let's talk about work, because the popular narrative is completely wrong here. Gen Z gets called lazy, they get called entitled. But when organizational psychologists actually study their workplace behavior, they find something different. Gen Z workers are not less motivated than previous generations. They're motivated by different things. They're less moved by loyalty to an institution and more moved by meaning, autonomy, and fairness. They watch their parents work themselves into the ground for companies that laid them off anyway. They watched the 2008 financial crisis erase the savings of people who did everything right. The social contract that previous generations operated on, work hard, stay loyal, and you'll be rewarded, had already broken down before Gen Z even entered the workforce. So when they ask, Why should I give everything to a job that won't give anything back? That's not laziness. That's pattern recognition. There's one more layer I want to add, because I think it's the most underappreciated thing about this generation. Gen Z grew up with algorithmic curation. Every feed they've ever used has been shaped by a system that learns what keeps them watching, what makes them click, what triggers an emotional response. And what that means, psychologically, is that Gen Z has been subjected to one of the most sophisticated systems of behavioral conditioning ever created. Not by a government, not by a school, but by a machine learning system optimizing for engagement. The implications of that are still unfolding. Researchers studying attention, motivation, and reward processing are just beginning to understand what it means to develop inside that environment. Gen Z didn't choose this. No one handed them a manual. They were just the first ones in. So here's what I keep coming back to. Every generation gets defined by the world that raised it. The greatest generation was shaped by scarcity and war. Boomers by post-war optimism. Gen the 10th by disillusionment. Millennials by rapid technological change. And Gen Z by something genuinely new and always on, algorithmically curated, globally anxious, identity fluid, psychologically hyper-aware world that no human brain had ever tried to navigate before. They're not broken. They're not fragile. They're responding, predictably and intelligently, to a completely unprecedented set of conditions. So maybe the more interesting question isn't what's wrong with Gen Z. Maybe it's, what does it tell us about the world that produced them?